Welcome to How to Complete a Budget Template. Research projects are established by Research Accounting once all relevant documentation is reviewed and approved for release by University Research Services. Once this occurs, URS will send a Release of Funds email notification to Research Accounting through the Tools for Research Administration at Queen's system, also known as the TRAC system. Before a research project can be established, Research Accounting will send a final budget and signing authority request email notification to principal investigators through TRAC. These two documents must be completed and submitted through the Research Accounting event form in TRAC before a new project can be established. Detailed instructions are provided in the email notification, and training videos are also available under the Awards section of the TRAC website. While project team members may help complete the budget template, the PI must submit the completed document through TRAC. This is to ensure that the PI is aware and in agreement with the budget for the project. The budget template form is used to establish the research project expense budget in Finance PeopleSoft by expense account. These details should reflect the best estimate of how project spending will be completed. The total budget must agree with the final approved research agreement or contract. Unless required by the funding agency, department, or hospital, PIs may choose to summarize the budget into fewer expense lines, as this will not impact how funds are actually spent. Next, we will review how to complete a final budget template. The final budget template is in an Excel document which contains 3 worksheets: the budget template worksheet, the overhead calculator worksheet, and the expense types worksheet. We will begin by discussing the budget template worksheet. The first step in completing the budget template is to enter the start date under the Year 1 column. The start date must coincide with the start date specified on the agreement or contract. In this example, we will use April 1st, 2016 as the start date. You will notice once you click on the Start Date field under Year 1, the required date format appears. As shown, Mac users are required to use a different date format. Next, you must enter the Year 1 end date. If the total grant or contract term is less than 1 year, enter the end date specified in the approved grant or contract. Otherwise, enter the end date for Year 1. In this example, an end date of March 31st, 2017 would reflect the end of Year 1. You will notice once a date is entered, the black background changes colors. The next section provides a breakdown of the different budget categories. If you are unsure of the type of expenses associated with a budget category, you may access additional details by clicking on the hyperlinked budget category descriptions. Hyperlinked values are displayed as underlined values. Clicking on one of these values will take you to the Expense Types worksheet, where a list of budget categories and their associated expense accounts are provided. You may also access this information simply by clicking on the Expense Types worksheet. Next, using details contained in the approved grant or contract, determine the total budget amount for Year 1. If there is an overhead component in the budget, you must exclude the overhead amount for now. In this example, we will assume a total budget of $1,400 for Year 1, which includes an overhead component of $400. Therefore, using the amount before overhead, in this case $1,000, we must now indicate how the funding will be spent. To do so, enter the appropriate amounts under the Year 1 column next to the applicable budget categories. In this example, we will allot $400 to the Students' Research category, $200 to lab supplies, and $400 to travel. You will notice the subtotal is automatically calculated as the total before overhead is considered. Before we move on to the next step, we will briefly discuss some of the budget categories. Many of the budget categories are standard categories which are used on a regular basis. However, budget category 603000 may be used in various scenarios. Therefore, we will discuss this category in a bit more detail. Budget category 603000 may be used for transfers out to other research facilities. For example, for multi-institutional projects led by Queen's University, Queen's may be required to transfer funds to other collaborating institutions. These details are often included in the approved grant or contract. In this scenario, amounts to be transferred to other institutions should be indicated in this field. Expense account 603001, Accountable Advance, is used to record these transfers. The second scenario this budget category may be used for involves transfers to other research facilities, often used for clinical trials. Expense account 603002, Per Case Funding, is used to record these transfers. When entering values for this scenario, instead of entering the total value, you must enter the number of estimated patients and the per subject fee. You will notice the total transfer amount will automatically calculate based on the amounts entered. The last scenario this budget category may be used for involves subject payments, which are recorded using expense account 603005, Subject Payments. When entering values for this category, similar to the per case funding example, instead of entering the total, you must enter the number of patients and the per subject fee. Again, the total transfer will automatically calculate based on the amounts entered. Next, we will discuss overhead. If your budget includes an overhead component, the overhead values are not entered on the budget template worksheet. As indicated, you must use the overhead calculator worksheet when entering overhead values. The first thing you will notice is the amounts entered on the budget template worksheet have automatically populated on the overhead calculator worksheet, next to the same budget categories used. As indicated, you must now enter the agreed upon overhead rate in the overhead rate column, next to each applicable budget category. For most grants or contracts, the same overhead rate will apply to all budget categories within the research project. However, in some cases, different overhead rates may apply to different budget categories within a project. For example, a 40% overhead rate may apply to the student's research category. A 5% overhead rate may apply to the lab supplies category, and a 10% overhead rate may apply to the travel category, all within the same project. In this example, we will assume a standard rate of 40% applies to all budget categories. The overhead portion of the budget in this case is $400, which represents a 40% overhead rate based on the total direct expenses of $1,000. Therefore, the next step involves entering an overhead rate of 40% next to each of the budget categories used. You will notice the total overhead is automatically calculated at $400. If we return to the budget template worksheet, you will notice the overhead is automatically calculated and the total year one budget now includes overhead. If your project does not include overhead, you may simply ignore the overhead calculator worksheet and indicate the total budget for year one on the budget template worksheet. If your project includes more than 1 year's funding, repeat these steps for each additional year on the budget template worksheet. Some important things to check once you are finished entering all of the budget details includes ensuring the total budget for each year coincides with the details contained in the approved research grant or contract. Ensuring the grand total reflects the total funding in the approved research grant or contract. And, if your project includes overhead, ensuring the total overhead amount is correct. If you are completing a final budget template for projects which exceed 7 years in length, you can complete one template for years 1 to 7, then complete a second budget template for the remaining budget years. Please ensure you attach both budget documents when submitting the Research Accounting Event Form in TRAC. When completing a budget template for Canada Research Chair, or CRC projects, there are some important considerations to keep in mind. Therefore, we will now review a final budget template for a CRC project. When completing a budget template for these projects, in order to align project budgets with revenues and minimize project overspending due to timing differences, each budget year must be reflected with an end date of March 31st, regardless of the CRC project start date. Therefore, if the project start date differs from April 1st, the first and last budget years will need to be prorated. Detailed instructions are provided in the final budget template and signing authority form request for CRC projects. However, we will review a detailed example. We will now consider a CRC project, which is $100,000 per year for a total of 5 years, with a start date of June 1st, 2016. To begin, a start date of June 1st, 2016 should be entered in the Year 1 column, with a corresponding end date of March 31st, 2017. Given this does not represent a full year, the Year 1 budget must be prorated to represent 10 months of the year, in this case, June to March. To do so, you must divide the first year's total funding amount of $100,000 by 12 months, then multiply this value by 10 months. In this case, the prorated amount for Year 1 is $83,333.33. Given CRC projects include overhead, the amount excluding overhead should be entered next to the appropriate category for Year 1, in this case, $60,000. For each subsequent budget year, the start and end dates will be April 1st to March 31st. Each full year's funding, excluding overhead, should be entered in the appropriate budget categories. For the final budget year, since the first year was prorated in this example, the final year must also be prorated up to the project end date. Given we prorated 10 months for Year 1, we will now prorate the remaining 2 months for the final budget year. To do so, you must divide the first year's total funding amount of $100,000 by 12 months. Then multiply this value by 2 months. In this case, the prorated amount for the final year is $16,666.67. However, the amount prior to overhead is only $12,000. Therefore, this value must be entered in the appropriate budget category. Overhead is handled, as previously demonstrated, by indicating the appropriate overhead rate next to the budget categories used in the overhead calculator worksheet. We will now return to the budget template worksheet and confirm the grand total mirrors the total funding in the approved research grant or contract, and the total overhead amount is correct. A completed signing authority form must be submitted along with the final budget template before a project can be established. The form must be completed and signed by the principal investigator and may also be used to assign specific permissions to authorized delegates, including access to view research transaction details and reports, electronic signing authority for online salary requests submitted through the HR system, and manual signing authority for research transactions. While other project team members may attach documents and help complete these forms, the PI must submit the research accounting form, including the final budget template and signing authority form as attached documents. In order to avoid processing delays, please ensure this approved TRAC procedure is followed. How may we help you today? If you have questions, give us a call at 613-533-2050. Our fax number is 613-533-6433. Email us at finance@queensu.ca or visit the Financial Services website. We are located at 207 Stewart Street, 3rd floor in the Rideau Building. Our hours of operation are Monday to Friday from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. This concludes our tutorial. To learn more or to review additional training resources and video tutorials, visit the Financial Services training page.